rights consultant, and it's my great pleasure to be welcoming you today to our event entitled United Arab Emirates, the Future of EU Gulf Relations in View of the Ongoing Serious Human Rights Abuses. I'm being joined by four distinguished speakers in this discussion. They are a member of the European Parliament, Mr. Dietmar Köster, international human rights lawyer and Queen's Counsel, Mr. Rodney Dixon, lawyer and founder of Detained International, Mr. David Haigh, and medical doctor and founding member of the Association for Victims of Torture in the UAE, Mr. Mahmood Aljaldah. Together, we will speak about the human rights violations in the United Arab Emirates, the UAE's relationship with the European Union, and what can be done by European stakeholders to improve the human rights situation in the country. Today's event is being live streamed on Twitter and YouTube, so for everyone who would like to ask some questions, please write them in the comments underneath the live stream. And similarly for the journalists in our stream, please write your questions in the chat box. The government of the United Arab Emirates has been pursuing a strategy to improve its image and to be perceived in the West as a country of religious tolerance, technological progress, and the anchor of stability in the region, with Dubai being an important economic and trade hub, while Abu Dhabi has invested heavily over the past years to become a cultural center with mega projects such as the Louvre and the Guggenheim Museum and branches of prestigious universities such as the Sorbonne or the NYU. Moreover, the UAE authorities created a Ministry of Happiness and host events such as the World Tolerance Summit, the Haigh Festival, and starting in a week from now, will be hosting the World Expo 2020. Yet the country's human rights record remains poor, and Emirati social and domestic policies are everything but progressive. Civil and political rights are severely restricted, and peaceful dissidents are often sentenced to long prison terms after unfair trials. The arrest and sentence of prominent human rights defender Ahmed Mansour to 10 years in prison illustrates the authorities' effort to silence all independent and critical civil society. In July of this year, the Pegasus Project, an international investigative journalism initiative, revealed the government's espionage on journalists, opposition politicians, activists, business people, and others using the private Pegasus spyware developed by the Israeli technology firm NSO Group. The UAE ruling family used this surveillance software for its digital crackdown on dissent at home and abroad, spying on over 10,000 people of interest linked to Dubai, and thereby making it one of the most extensive files in the spying scandal. One of our guests, Mr. David Haigh, has been a victim of this cyber attack and will be able to tell us a bit more about it. With that being said, we're all very pleased to see that just a week ago, the European Parliament passed a strong resolution on the human rights situation in the United Arab Emirates. The resolution discusses the case of prominent human rights defender Ahmed Mansour and many other unlawfully detained prisoners of conscience. It also touches upon issues of women's rights and migrant rights, as well as the flawed legal system enabling the prosecution of peaceful dissent. It further expresses concern about the UAE authorities' use of the NSO Group spyware for the unlawful targeting of the mobile phones of hundreds of individuals. Lastly, in order to signal disapproval of the human rights violations in the UAE, the resolution invites the international companies sponsoring the Expo 2020 to withdraw their sponsorship and encourages EU member states not to participate in the event. As you can see, there is much to be discussed in today's event. So without further ado, I would like to now hand over to my guests. Let me start by introducing our key speaker, Professor Dr. Dietmar Köster, who is a German member of the European Parliament's group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. He's been a member of the European Parliament since 2014, and he's currently part of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Subcommittee on Human Rights. So I'm very curious to hear from him, and I'm sure he can share some of his experience from the European Parliament, maybe also give us a little background on the recent resolution of the Parliament. So over to you, Mr. Köster.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Mrs. Legner, for your kind introduction and for your warm welcome. When we talk about human rights in the United Arab Emirates, we see that the government's rhetoric and the actual situation on site differ vastly. You have mentioned it in your introduction. 2 weeks ago, the UAE announced the establishment of a new Institute for Human Rights. About the same time, the UAE's federal court sentenced a Syrian human rights activist to 10 years in prison. The reasons: insulting the prestige of the state and alleged membership in a terrorist organization because of his contact with human rights organizations. Most prominently, the misanthropic convictions on the detention of Ahmed Mansour raised international dismay. The European Parliament already passed a resolution to raise its concerns about Mansour's arrest in 2018. Due to the seriousness of the case, the European Parliament passed a second resolution on this last week. And in this judgment, we again condemned Mansour's imprisonment in the strongest possible terms and demanded his immediate and unconditional release. Bizarre inconsistencies in the UAE are anything but new. The Emirati constitution explicitly prohibits torture according to Article 26. Still, incidents of torture continue to reach us in the European Parliament. Therefore, despite its constitutional principles, vague legal definitions in the country, for instance, of terrorism, open the door for authorities to prosecute and imprison peaceful activists. That is why we called on the UAE authorities to amend their counterterrorism law in our resolution last week. Behind those human rights violations always lie the fate of individuals. This is why I, in line with other members of the European Parliament, drew attention to individual cases and expressed our deep concern about the systematic crackdown on human rights in the UAE. In a letter to Josep Borrell in April 2021, we asked him to encourage the Emirati government to release all political activists, human rights activists, and journalists who were ill-treated immediately and to investigate allegations of torture. Human rights violations in the UAE go beyond the undignified treatment of detainees. Women continue to face discrimination in law and in practice. Especially foreign or migrant workers face abuse under the kafala system, most often through delayed or unpaid wages. Therefore, the European Parliament invited international companies to withdraw their sponsorship from Dubai Expo 2020 last week. In addition, LGBTIQ people face discrimination by law. Peaceful dissidents not only have to fear for their own safety, but also for that of their families in the form of collective punishment. The Pegasus leak of July 2021 about the UAE's use of spyware to target activists shockingly revealed how UAE authorities approach voices of dissent. Looking at the relations between the European Union and the United Arab Emirates, trade in military equipment cannot go hand in hand with a commitment to human rights. In February 2021, the European Parliament called for a ban on arms sales to the United Arab Emirates, since there is evidence that such arms are being used in Yemen. In this context, a recast of the dual-use regulation, which entered into force on the 9th of September 2021, aims to better control dual-use goods, taking into account new technological developments. The regulation is a first step but more ambitious disarmament efforts must follow. In concrete terms, this means that respective EU member states must suspend the export, sale, or maintenance of surveillance technologies as long as there is no movement in this issue. It is essential that the European Parliament keeps up a frank dialogue with its partners in the region. Therefore, we must continue to urge the European External Action Service to continue monitoring the human rights situation in the UAE. We also need more transparency. The European Parliament calls for stringent rules for foreign lobbying activists in this regard towards all the EU institutions. When a country's soft power strategy is characterized by distracting terms like sports washing, which may help Manchester City advance in the Premier League, but certainly not the human rights situation on the ground. At the beginning of this month, reports occurred about hundreds of African workers in Abu Dhabi who were arrested and deported. Even though the government tries to portray the country as being in line with global human rights standards, such incidents are a depressing reminder that these promises do not correspond to reality. Therefore, it is essential to talk about the human rights abuses that people in the UAE experience. We must continue to raise awareness and urge UAE authorities to ensure that such fundamental rights, which are already enshrined in the country's constitution, are finally enforced. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Costa, for your presentation and for your support, both in the recent resolution, as well as that letter you mentioned that you sent to Joseph Borrell, and sort of calling it by its name, the whitewashing and sports washing efforts by the United Arab Emirates authorities, and what has to be done, and that we need continued exerted pressure on the authorities, and that we need to hear the stories from individuals suffering human rights violations inside the country. I would now like to hand over to David Haigh. David is a lawyer and an entrepreneur. He's also a former managing director of Leeds United Football Club. In 2014, and following a business dispute, David was arrested in Dubai and kept in arbitrary detention for 23 months. Not least due to his personal ordeal, he later decided to establish Detained International, an organization that provides pro bono legal advocacy to victims of injustice, inequality, and other human rights violations in Dubai, the wider United Arab Emirates, and the Middle East. David will share some of his firsthand experience, as well as inform us on individuals he currently supports who have been or are still subjected to human rights abuses in the UAE. And feel free to share with us also about your experience being part of one of the individuals who are subjected to cyber attacks in the recent NSO Group Pegasus scandal. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Julia. And as you mentioned, I come today to the conversation with something of a unique experience. You know, I've lived in Dubai for 11 years. The last 2 years of that was in a horrific situation in a jail where I suffered torture, inhumane and degrading treatment, and abuse. And that's something that was found by the English courts, the Scottish courts in 2017. So I've got the aspect of living there as an expat, being in the jails in the UAE and experiencing the human rights abuses myself, but also watching those human rights abuses on other people. And then when I finally left the UAE, the last charge was Twitter abuse, where I was held for 9 months for Twitter abuse before I was released. I returned to the UK, and then I felt that it was incumbent on me to help other people that had been through that. Whilst I was going through that type of abuse, I thought that it was so extraordinary and so frightening that it couldn't be happening to anybody else. But what I've realized now, since 2016 until now, which is when I've been helping other victims of injustice and abuse there is that it's common practice, if not institutionalized. And so when I came back from Dubai in 2016, I started to help Brits, other expats, and Emiratis that were suffering various different types of abuse, usually unfair trials, torture, and inhumane and degrading treatment. And at that time, and this is another unique perspective, particularly as we're talking about the EU today, obviously the UK was part of the EU. So we had shared laws in various areas, and obviously now we're not, and I'll come on to that later on. So we set up an organisation called Detained International, and since 2016, we've helped several hundred people from small cases where they're placed in jail for a bounce check to significant cases like the daughter of the very ruler of Dubai, who escaped in fear of her life, and then was effectively jailed for 3 years. Similarly, the former wife of the ruler of Dubai, Princess Haigh of Jordan, who fled Dubai in fear of her life, and similarly, the first wife of the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Randa al-Banna, who similarly suffered abuse. So through my experience in helping those people, we've got a wide range of evidence that it's expats, it's tourists, and it's the Emiratis' own citizens, and it's their own citizens not just at the normal level, but right the way up to the royal family. So they don't discriminate when it comes to abusing people. It's everyone, and so that gives me a unique perspective on, I think, on you know, a whole range of experience on the depth of their human rights abuses. And then, as you mentioned, Julia, I mean, quite recently, I was informed by Amnesty International that they suspected that my phone, because of the work that I was doing with Princess Latifa and Princess Haigh, where I've been a witness on criminal investigations into the ruler of Dubai, they suspected my phone had been monitored and hacked, and that I'd been put under surveillance. I gave them my phone, they checked it, and they found Pegasus software that was infected my phone just over a year ago on the 3rd of August. Now that's a very key date, because as many of the viewers and listeners may know, we lost contact. We managed to smuggle a phone into Latifa jail villa, and we lost contact with Latifa on the 21st of July, 2020. My phone was infected just over a week later. And then people that were mentioned on my phone in certain messages with Latifa, their phones were then infected shortly after. And one particular person, the wife of the former wife of the ruler, the first wife, was put under a exceptionally strange house arrest in Italy by Dubai state security. So you've got a wide area of human rights abuses, of sheer and utter lawlessness, hacking people's phones, putting them under surveillance, no matter what country they're in. And one of the things that we're looking for at the moment at Detained International, in 2000, Latifa's sister, Sheikha Samsa, was kidnapped from the streets of the UK. That's been found now by the English High Court that happened, and that the Dubai ruler orchestrated that. But to date, and this is, I think, a very key point when it comes to the UAE and human rights abuses, on that, no one has stood up to justice yet. There's been no justice for what has happened. No one's investigated, fully kidnapped, and no one's been brought to justice. Similarly, when Princess Latifa, her friend, a Finnish national, EU national, Tina Haigh, a French national, and 3 Filipino crew were kidnapped illegally at gunpoint in the Indian Ocean. The world knows that that horrific incident took place in 2018 against EU nationals. No one has been brought to justice. Why? And I think that's for me, that's something that's very, very important to look at, because we see continued and repeated breaches of the most standard human rights laws across the world in any country, or even just laws of kidnap, laws of piracy, that are broken, and that nothing is ever done against the UAE. Whereas if other countries did that, ones that don't have such a good PR firm, then I think it would be different. And I think that's one of the things that it would be interesting to discuss today, because their treatment, the UAE's treatment of human rights and the way they view them, their view of human rights to me is effectively a disease that's spreading through the human rights world. And if we allow the UAE to get away with breaching human rights with impunity, then other countries will think, well, they're doing it, we can do it as well. And then the human rights legislation that we've spent decades putting together could start to crumble. And I think that's something that's we need to ensure. And I think it's an area where the EU, given its size, can work on to ensure that that doesn't happen.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, David. Thanks for the work you do. Thank you for sharing your firsthand experience with us. And I think you've raised an important point, the issue of impunity. Like, how come they're getting away with this for that long? And as we said, the variety of different violation is vast, and yet they're still sort of hosting international events such as the Expo, and they're continuing to try to attract foreign investment. So what kind of leverage can we have as Europeans, and what can European politicians really do to ensure that there is a genuine human rights reform happening in the country? Can we make that a condition for future engagement? Maybe we can come back to that and other questions in our question round. But I would now like to move on to our next guest, Dr. Mahmood Aljaldah. He's a medical doctor from Qatar. In February 2013, he was arrested by agents of the UAE State Security Forces while transiting through Dubai Airport on his way home from a vacation abroad. Dr. Aljaldah was tortured and forced to sign confessions while being held in secret detention for 8 months. He was later sentenced by the Federal Supreme Court to 7 years in prison under the pretext of funding and helping an illegal secret organization on the sole basis of these forced confessions. He was released after a presidential pardon in May 2015. Dr. Aljaldah is a founding member of the 2017 established Association for Victims of Torture in the UAE. The association is a Geneva-based NGO that works to help victims of torture and ill treatment in the UAE, utilizing international human rights mechanisms and the universal jurisdiction to fight impunity and put an end to torture and ill treatment. Dr. Aljaldah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank all of you by giving me the chance to present myself in this organization on this event. And in fact, I should say it is painful to talk about your negative point. But if you close your eyes and you don't see your negative, you will never improve. And because of that, I accept to be talking about UAE. UAE is part of our Gulf countries, and in fact, we should not accept to talk about them. But this is the fact. And as you have mentioned in your introduction, they have built a good image for themselves by taking care about building and roads, streets, bridge, but they never take care about the human, which is the most important base for improving the country. As you know, I think I am a medical doctor. I am manager of healthcare department in Qatar Petroleum. I am also a member in the Association of Victims of UAE, which is based in the Geneva, and which is non-governmental human right organization. In fact, it is. I have been coming from Thailand. I was escorting my brother in Thailand. He got a stroke there, so I went to see him from Dubai. I went when I came back, going from Dubai to Doha. They have been arrested. Then I think. Can you move the slide, please? So move next. So I have been arrested. Yes, this is. I have been arrested, and they asked me to ask me some questions. So when I went there, they asked me questions. Then they take all my things from the plane and look for things as they are looking for something in the bags. But unfortunately, they didn't find anything. Then they forced me on the car. They handfolded me and blindfolded my eyes, and they took me to an unknown place, which I don't know really. I was in solitary confinement for 8.5 months. This really was very stressful for me, and it was first of my life I facing this thing. So they started. I remember I reached there by 10 p.m. Even they took me from the airport at 6 p.m. But so they drive for me, and I don't know where is it, but for about 2 hours, which I analyzed it. They took me from Dubai to Abu Dhabi. Since they arrested me, they started asking me, and they took all the time for 3 days continuously. They are interrogation me 24 hours. They don't allow me to accept to go to the washroom or to have meal. At the first hour, I remember that they asked me, "Do you know this person?" I said, "No, I don't know." So they slapped me in my face, and I was shocked, really. I didn't remember at this age somebody will ask me and slap me in my face. So I asked them, before they start the interrogation, I told them I want to call my embassy. I want to call my family. At least they should know. And I remember that day I came from Thailand because my wife, she was in operation theater. So I told them they are waiting for me, and I should inform them at least that I am in UAE and I need that time. So they denied all my requests, and they keep asking things. They bit me by stick in my body, that there is a lot of ecchymosis in my body. It happened there, which I went and complained to the doctor. But unfortunately, their doctor is part of their team. Also, I complain of chest pain, which I will go in detail about my health situation. So from the first day, I complained that I have chest pain, but they denied. Then I told them I am a medical doctor, and chest pain is really serious. It can be, especially I was under stress and feel palpitation, chest tightness. So after midnight, they took me to the one nurse, and he did ECG for me. But he told me, "Don't worry, only you have tachycardia because of the situation." And they returned me back for integration. They took all that night. Morning, I went just for washroom. Then they take me back for integration. They keep asking me unbelievable questions, yani, for even about my grandmothers, my grandfathers. So they take a lot of details about me. So after 3 days, really they allowed me to sleep for 2 hours. Just I relax, they wake me up and start again continuous the integration. After that, really 5th or 6th day, they told me we don't need more information from you, and they told me within 2 days you may be released. So really I was happy that at least there is something coming. But on 14th of March, at night they called me to and asked me to wear my traditional dress. They asked me that they are going to take a video film that one of the sheikh will see it, and after that they may release me. And they promised me that by tomorrow that they will release me. In fact, before they take the film, they gave me an orange juice, which I was really I was surprised. What happened? Yani, and they brought I remember 2 jakes, one orange juice, one pineapple juice, and they told me choose one. So I drank some. I feel that I become talkative. This happened even in the integration. I was very thirsty. I asked for water. They gave me one open bottle with the 1/3 of the bottle or half of the bottle. There is water, and it have been used. Yani. So really, I was thinking, should I drink it or not? But I was very thirsty. I drank it. Then I started to become very talkative. I cannot control myself. And it's known that some drugs make you talkative, and even you cannot control yourself. So this is my analysis that they give me. This video, when they took it, I asked them, I don't want it because you will keep it in the media, but they give me promise that it will not. Unfortunately, 2 years after I have been released, there was a conflict between them and Qatar. They put this video in the media over all UAE channels media and Bahrain media also. This video keep very deep wound in me, as it was integration, and it is a pure private information. So they put it to the public, and I don't know how the channel got it. And it was in the prison. How the channel got this video film? So I raised a case against them in the Ofcom, and thank God that I won it. And the Ofcom decision was against the channel, and they asked them to pay 200,000 UK pound. So this is part of the Ofcom. So the Ofcom, this is Ofcom report. I'm surprised really with all these things, and I have been invited to United Nations, invited to many events to talk about my experience. So United Nations, they have raised and show that I am here showing my name, Mahmood Aljaldah, and my son also was arrested during the court. So he came to attend the court for 1 day, and they arrested him for 1 day. And unfortunately, also they take a film from him. In fact, we are living in a hypocrite society. As please, the previous slide. As you have seen, there is a lot of previous slide, please. Yes. There is a lot of complaint, and there is a lot of things raised against UAE. and their and United Nations and European United. But when you come to the fact and the life, you can see that UAE people, they are the only GCC nationality. They enter European United countries without visa, the only GCC country. All Gulf, we need a visa to go, Schengen visa, to go to the European, except UAE. So how it's coming, with all this human rights violence, but they are preferred than the others. So it's not going together. So the politics is not going with the human right. Next. So also the Interpol, they have chosen one of UAE person to be a member in their committee, and these people was affected, and they were involved in the human right violence. So it's need to review our things, our relation, to correct. Otherwise, if I am doing wrong and not punished, I will continue whatever you talk about me. Talking is nothing, but if you are doing something, then I will be affected, and at least to review my situation. Next, please. So thank you for listening, and I hope this will affect direct or indirect in the relationship and improve the situation in UAE, as even the national people there, they are suffering a lot. And then when they put me in Razin prison, really I saw some of the prisoners with me. They have evacuated their nationality, their families, so they are suffering a lot more than us, really. And somebody should lead the things to justice and be effective. And we think that United Nations and European country have the power to do that and effect in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aljaldah, for your testimony and for continuing to advocate for human rights in the UAE. I think your story is very emblematic of the abuses that are being perpetrated by security agents in the UAE, including these methods of videotyped confessions, videotyped coerced confessions. So it's very important that we keep hearing those individual stories. Last but not least, let me introduce to you our fourth speaker, international human rights lawyer and Queen's Counsel Rodney Dixon. He specializes in international criminal law and has assisted many victims of human rights abuses in the Middle East, often through filing complaints under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Based on your experience, what are the most concerning human rights? Issues in the UAE, and what can be done by international and European stakeholders to address them? Maybe, Rodney, you also want to address the upcoming Expo 2020 or the NSO spying scandal, or what to make of and how to use the recent EP resolution to advance human rights reform. Over to you. Sorry, Rodney, you're still on mute.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you well.
Thank you. As Julia mentioned, I have represented a number of persons and continue to do so who have been detained and tortured in the UAE or had other human rights violations committed against them, as I have done in many other countries as well, not only in the UAE. We are focusing today on this particular country, but we shouldn't forget that these abuses go on around the world without enough attention being given and action being taken to stop them. In respect of the UAE, I think, as all of the speakers have highlighted, it is a deep-rooted and endemic problem, which has been ongoing for decades. And because little has been done to take concrete action to stop it, it has grown and has become more pervasive. I think we've reached a point now where, based on all of the evidence that we have about what has been going on, that a very clear line has to be drawn. Many of the speakers have been highlighting how little action has been taken. And I was struck again only this week with world leaders getting together at the General Assembly in New York, how many were talking about our shared common values of democracy, liberty, freedom, human rights. And yet at the same time, there's the cold reality that there are massive abuses going on, particularly in the UAE, where none of those were singled out, and also where very little has been done by those world leaders to ensure that they put their words into practice. It's just far too easy to say these things and then not actually follow up on them in the interests of keeping the peace or good diplomatic relations and economic ties and trade. And very often you will hear people saying, well, look, we have to keep dealing with countries like the UAE. We can't cut ourselves off. It's better that we're there and engaging and they are able to hear us, and we can work change in that way from within. But unfortunately, we haven't seen the tangible results of that. And I fear that much of it is really a pretense. It's far too easy to say that you support these ideals, but then actually not have the courage and the honesty to follow through on them. And what message does that send? I mean, it sends, as people have been highlighting, a message of impunity. It says to people in the country, look, if you want to stand up and be a voice against what is happening, or in any country where there's repression, you are going to be on your own at the end of the day. We might support you rhetorically. We might pass some resolutions, and I'm not being critical of the resolutions, but at the end of the day, concrete action has to be taken. Otherwise, those persons who are on the front line fighting for democracy in these countries will feel that they are completely abandoned. So it's not going to encourage democracy. And there's little point to talk the democracy talk if you're not ready to protect it in the real world and allow it to flourish. So I was struck again by that just recently this week, with so much good and big talk in New York, but then you come back to the fact that there is still an expo going on. The UAE is pushing very hard for one of its people from the Ministry of Interior, General Al-Raisi, to be the head of the International Police Force, Interpol. And there doesn't seem to be much opposition to that. We are hoping that there will be voices that speak out and take tangible action against that. And as has been highlighted, there was a rampant hacking campaign of telephones, surveillance going on. And yes, it was big news for a week, but once again, it's faded into the background. And it's hard to believe that actually nothing has been done about it. And what what is that signaling? That these kinds of activities can continue unabated. You've just heard from Dr. Aljaldah. I mean, imagine in his case where you get a confession tortured out of you, recorded, and then it's handed over to a national television station and it's broadcast as though it is a voluntary interview of somebody confessing and admitting to being a terrorist, without explaining the background. It's broadcast on national news and around the world. It was broadcast in the UK as well, saying here's a doctor admitting to being a terrorist. I mean, the deception there is quite overwhelming. I had another client who was detained and beaten, and then was taken by the UAE authorities to a doctor. The first doctor wasn't prepared to sign off on this, but the second doctor essentially signed a medical certificate saying that these injuries were self-inflicted by my client. And the UAE authorities have relied on that to say, we did nothing. He did these things to himself. Here's a doctor's report to prove it. I mean, once again, the deception is staggering. And I don't see how our leaders around the world can stomach that, can continue to deal with people as though life is going on normally when there's that kind of very clear, concrete evidence. We'd never allow our national authorities, our police forces, to do that within our national jurisdictions. So why do we allow it between jurisdictions and internationally? Why don't we have the moral principle to stand up and call people out and ensure that these cases are properly investigated and that there is justice, and that you can't therefore go ahead and host the expo, this massive economic trade fair, when you are relying on those kinds of policies internally against your own people and against internationals as well. This is not just perpetrated against persons inside the country, but against UK citizens from around the world. So there's a clear international component. Why do we countenance this? This, for me, has to be the central message today, that yes, a groundbreaking step has been taken with the adoption of a very strong EU resolution. But it's not going to be worth the paper it's written on unless it is now implemented and steps are taken not to allow the expo to go ahead, not to allow these kinds of crimes and abuses to continue. There has to be a point, and it must be now, where we are drawing that line as politicians, as lawyers, as human rights defenders, as journalists, academics across the board, to say that where these kinds of abuses are so prevalent and are intensifying, increasing, then we are not just going to stand back and continue as though it's all normal. We're not just going to pass resolutions. We are going to ensure that these principles are tangibly upheld. So that's what I really want to emphasize today. I've gone through many cases, heard many testimonies. We've heard more today, and we're going to continue doing that unless we have the backbone finally to draw that line. This has to be the time now. This has to be the year to do it. This has to be the moment that we seize, and to ensure that we can not look on ourselves and our leaders and our policies with shame any longer, because it casts shame on all of us for these things to happen right underneath our noses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rodney Dixon, for your statement, and I think for really emphasizing the point that it's high time that after all those words, we see action and concrete steps taken to to not allow this situation to continue, and for the UAE to have to really significantly improve its human rights record before we continue cooperation. I would just very quickly like to hand back to David, who's given me a sign that he wanted to add something to his statement before. I would still like to also, or after which I would like to then take a couple of questions. David, please go ahead.
Julia, thank you. I said earlier on that we've listened obviously to my fellow guests, and to I think it's Dr. Aljaldah, who mentioned about Interpol and General al-Raisi. And I said earlier on that the way that I viewed the UAE's treatment of human rights was effectively infecting the protection and promotion of human rights as a disease that's spreading. And we've seen now and heard from my fellow guests that we have the UAE trying to take control of the world's police force, the UAE trying to take control of extraditions, the UAE trying to take control of expos, and it goes on. And I think it's incumbent on us now to ensure that no longer happens. Now, if we look at the EU and we look at extraditions, I give a lot of evidence in defence to prevent extraditions of individuals from England, from Europe to the UAE. And that's one area, I think, where large groups like the UAE, like the EU, can actually have some impact. Now, in England, we haven't extradited anyone to the UAE for a very long time, yet we still have an extradition treaty that costs the British taxpayer millions of pounds a year to have there and have in force. Yet we know that when the UAE makes an extradition request, that individual in the UK is not going to be extradited. Now, I imagine, and Mr. Costa can no doubt comment, that that's a similar situation all the way across the EU. So a body like the EU can work together and perhaps suspend those extradition treaties until the UAE updates and follows human rights norms, as has been done in the case of Russia and Hong Kong. And I just wanted to leave you with one of the judgments where I gave extradition evidence, defense evidence for an extradition, which was an Abu Dhabi attempted extradition against a Scottish grandfather. I gave evidence to them in 2017 on what happened to me. And I just wanted to read out the findings of the UK court as to what the Dubai police and the UAE authorities did, because I think they're very powerful. So just bear with me a moment. I'll just get that up. Just bear with me a moment. So this is the UK judge. David Haigh struck me as an honest, intelligent witness who gave his evidence with calm dignity. He was obviously a man who had been significantly physically and psychologically damaged by his ordeal in the UAE and was in the process of what I consider will be a long recovery. I believed his evidence when he indicated that high-ranking Emiratis have influence over and access to the police and other aspects of civil society. I have no doubt he was telling the truth about seeing a civilian lawyer who acted for his former employers in Dubai police station in the company of a police officer pointing at him before being questioned and beaten by the Dubai police. The clear inference that a civilian lawyer had influence as to how he was badly treated and abused by the police is irresistible. I fully accept he was repeatedly seriously assaulted by Dubai police officers and tasered while at the Dubai police station. I accept he was interrogated and forced to sign a document in Arabic, the content of which he did not understand. Thereafter, I believe the account he gave of squalid, overcrowded and insanitary detention conditions in the Dubai police station. I further believe he was sexually assaulted in the car park of that police station during his detention. Those are the findings of a UK judge where the UAE was represented and didn't appeal. They are findings of exactly what my fellow guests have been saying, but they're the findings of a court. And I thought that was quite a powerful thing for us all to listen to. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for sharing this. And I think, yeah, we have really plenty of evidence that needs to be acted upon now. And yeah, it's we can no longer ignore that amount of evidence. It's been confirmed by a court in the UK. It's been confirmed really through all the testimonies of the victims. I think that the European Parliament, the UN, they have all attested to that. And yeah. We need to see action. So I would like to pass the floor now to a journalist that is with us in this live stream, David Kampmann from the Jordan Times, to ask a couple of questions. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much. First of all, can you all hear me loud and clear?
Yes.
Good. That is great. Rodney Dixon, I would like to quote you on something you said referring to Western countries, notably in the European Union, that, quote, little action has been taken. Now, that question basically concerns all of you. What are the tangible actions that you think should be taken, and actions that should be taken in order to be fruitful by Western countries, notably by the European Union?
I don't know, Rodney, if you want to go ahead and answer that straight away, or someone else wants to come in.
Yes, I can start it off. I'm sure everyone has a lot to say. I'll just focus on one aspect, the legal cases. As a lawyer involved in this area, no one has been prosecuted for these acts of torture and wrongful detentions in the UAE, or when persons travel outside of the UAE to any of our countries. Either the police in these countries say that they don't have sufficient evidence, or they're unable to arrest the person based on the evidence, or sometimes immunity issues are raised. I think all of these are falsehoods which we need to cut through. It's about a basic crime. It's about persons being assaulted, and in these situations, it's vital that persons are investigated, put on trial, and if there's sufficient evidence, that they're convicted. We just wouldn't allow in our national jurisdictions the police to do these things and to get away with it. Why should we allow it in other jurisdictions, especially where it's often perpetrated against EU nationals, UK nationals? So that would be a very good starting point. Put people on trial, and where there's sufficient evidence, convict them of these crimes. That will ensure that there is deterrence in the future, and that there's justice for the victims.
And Julia, if you want me to add to that, I think I think one of the areas, and Rodney's been involved in it recently, that we can actually bring the UAE to account is using what's termed widely now the Magnitsky Law. So the human rights sanctions that were passed in the UK last year are in place in America and Canada, and soon to be passed in Australia and in the EU. Now, we haven't seen any Emiratis on that list yet, but I've been involved with Rodney and with others in filing sanction requests. There's currently sanction requests going in on behalf of an American called Zach Shaheen, someone we're helping. He's the longest serving overseas American prisoner for a white collar crime. He's in the UAE. He's essentially sentenced to die there for a crime he didn't commit. So we're filing sanctions next month there. And I think that's one area, again, where large bodies like the EU, UK can get together, and whilst these individuals may not have criminal convictions against them, we can use those laws to bring them to justice, to ensure that their blood money, for want of a better phrase, and I think that's the one that the Foreign Secretary in England used, isn't able to be spent in countries like England. And I think another area where Dubai's and the UAE is in a very unique position is because they rely so heavily on tourism and so heavily on leisure and sport, and that gives every single person, each individual, quite a lot of sway, because people can boycott Dubai. They can decide not to go there on holiday. They can realize it's not a safe place to go on holiday or to do business. It's not a tolerant place. And that's campaigns that we've run in the past. It's the individual people that have all got together and spoken loudly that's forced Dubai to make changes, because they need tourism. and without tourism and without business and without the expats, and if the world starts to see the country for what it is, and that is an intolerant police state run by a dictator, I think you would have serious issues. And I think that's the international community needs to get together and not just look at sanctions and bringing these people to account, but also looking at boycotts. I know it's something that, as I mentioned, Zach Shaheen, something we're doing there. When the Americans find out about his case, that a fellow American citizen has just been effectively left there and locked up to die, they're appalled. And the first thing that we've seen they say is that we're not going to go there. We're not going to take an Emirates flight. We're not going to go and watch Godolphin races. I think that's what people need to do. They need to vote with their feet and with their wallets as well. And I think that will really impact the UAE.
Thank you very much, David. And if it's all right for everyone, I would like to continue 5 more minutes. I've seen Mr. Costa, you would like to add something as well. I think something you mentioned before in terms of concrete steps was also the possibility of stopping export of dual-use goods, weapons, and surveillance technology to the UAE. And as David mentioned, sanction regimes, there's also the new EU sanction regime. I don't know if you might want to pick up on that or if you have some other ideas of concrete steps. Mr. Costa, you're still on mute. Yeah.
Okay, I hope now you can hear me. Okay, great. First of all, I want to highlight I'm really deeply impressed of the report of David Haigh and Mahmood Aljaldah and what they have suffered, and I can understand well that there is a big disappointment regarding the concrete measures which the European Union should initiate against the UAE. But it is true, the UAE and the infringement, the breaches of fundamental rights are not in the focus of the foreign policy in the European Union. It is a reality because we have the situation in Afghanistan, and when we discuss about Afghanistan, we can read in the newspapers that UAE played a constructive role, rescuing more than 28,000 women from the Taliban, and so on and so on. And I think it's the controversial situation has to do, or the contradictory situation has to do, that there are so many dreadful places in the world, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iran, and so on and so on. And even in the European Union itself, we are undermining our own values. If you have a look regarding how we treat refugees and migrants at our external borders, more than 15,000 migrant refugees drowned in the Mediterranean, and we push them back to Libya, where they are put into detention center, and where they are treated as slaves, and so on and so on. This is not an excuse, but nevertheless, I can say I've learned much today, and I will take this on board for my work in the subcommittee of the human rights. And I think for me, and this is what we are discussing in the subcommittee of human rights, is that we have the new measures, how we can use the human rights sanction regime. I think this is very important, and we are discussing the impunity of those who are committed in these breaches of international law. I will try to put it on the agenda of our committee for human rights, and I will try to push it forward. But it is not only a powerlessness you feel for yourself. Sometimes it's for the deputy in the European Parliament. What you witness often that you are kind of powerless. But it is important that we have such a resolution, because this is the basic on which we can work on, and on which we can develop concrete measures to put the regime in the UAE under pressure. And for me, it is very important that the European Union should suspend the exports of surveillance technologies and suspend arms. This is very important for me. And we will try to develop pressure. We will put it again on the political agenda to achieve something. But to confess, it is not easy to reach something. And what we can learn from example, from my point of view, from Afghanistan, is that we need pressure outside the society of the United Arab Emirates, which we can support, who are fighting against the government and who are fighting for democracy. But even if you have a look at Belarus, it's difficult. That's so far from my side.
Thank you, Mr. Köster. Is there anyone who wants to give another statement?
Just
Dr.
one
Aljaldah,
comment.
yes, please.
Yes, thank
Go
you.
ahead.
I think we should have a pressure and evaluate a pressure on UAE to evaluate their court system. They don't allow any human rights organization to attend any of the courts. They don't allow the media except their own media, and there is no appeal even. If the case finish and the person wants to appeal, he is not allowed to appeal. So this shows that there is no really a justice system even in their court. So this is, I think, by internationally we can force people to follow the international justice system. So this is what happened to us. I mean, we couldn't appeal. Nobody have attended. A lot of human rights organizations have asked to attend the court. They didn't allow them. And finally, the judge will say his words. Even believe me, and I'm not saying a joke. He's saying wrong names with no wrong decision. It's as they wrote for him to read it. This is what happened to me personally. So this is the situation. It's a really very bad situation, and by pressure, it will improve. Yani, for example, it's not if the all your European countries said we will stop giving the Emirati people to enter without visa because of human rights, they will be forced to change their situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aljaldah, and a big thank you to all the guests of today's discussion. I think we all agree on the fact that that this resolution in the European Parliament is a very strong foundation and has some very strong calls, and that now we need to see sort of concrete steps follow and those recommendations be implemented as well. And I think we've also seen that there's a lot that can be done on various different levels, be that through sanctions regimes or international legal complaints, but also on the side of the member states to really press for the stop of arms exports or surveillance technology exports. Maybe also a hearing at the European Parliament's Committee on Human Rights on the UAE and the ongoing abuses there. I think that is maybe something that we can envision. But it's also, at the end of the day, the responsibility of all of us individually, as David Haigh mentioned rightly, to not go and travel to Dubai for tourism purposes, and exert pressure as individual civil society, but also as politicians to oppose the presidency of Major al-Raisi to Interpol and to continue calling for the boycott of the Expo 2020 and other events that allow the UAE authorities to whitewash its image. So on that note, I thank all of you very much, and I wish you all a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.